Hello students, welcome to Byju's IAS. Welcome to a session on economy this week, wherein we'll be taking up some of the very important economy related articles that have appeared in various business related newspapers, and we'll be analyzing these particular articles. For this particular video, I've chosen the time period from 1st of June to 14th of June 2020, and the articles that I've taken up are from Hindu, Indian Express, Business Standard, Live Mint and Business Line. Let's begin the discussion here. The first very important article is related to the labor law amendments or reforms which have been proposed by various state governments. Some of the very important points are labor will fall in the concurrent list, which means both center as well as state can formulate the laws on this particular subject. In case there is a conflict of a provision, the provision of the center will prevail over the law of the state. Very recently, various state governments such as Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh have taken certain steps wherein they have relaxed or suspended these particular labor laws. And there has been a lot of criticism as well as the appreciation towards these particular measures which have been taken. This particular article discusses one side of the discussion, that is, it basically criticizes and gives the way forward with respect to the labor laws. Now, we will have a discussion related to the overall viewpoint of these particular reforms. First and foremost, as a result of this particular subject being in the concurrent list, both center as well as states put together have a huge number of labor laws. As per a document published by Niti Aayog, both center as well as the states put together, there are more than 140 labor laws in India. And various experts over a period of time have been asking for the governments to amend or make certain changes to these particular labor laws. For example, most of the times they will have a discussion related to the hiring and firing policy in case of India. Now please understand this, if a particular company has more than 100 people, more than 100 full-time employees, this particular company is supposed to take a permission before hiring or basically letting of these particular workers. In various states, this particular number has been increased, for example, Rajasthan government. But over a period of time, the demand from the private sector has been that the government must relax these particular labor laws. Now, what is the problem with respect to labor laws? First and foremost, the number of labor laws are too many. As the number of labor laws are too many, that is very high in number, basically complying with these particular labor laws will become very difficult for these particular companies. And whenever the MNCs, multinational corporations or foreign companies are entering into any of the economy, one very important parameter that they will look at is how easy it is to comply with the labor laws. So the difficulty in complying has become one of the very important issues which has been discussed over a period of time. And the private sector, like I said, has been asking for the government to change these particular provisions. Second, most of these particular labor laws which were formulated have been formulated very long time ago. If you see the Industrial Disputes Act or Factories Act, all these particular laws were formulated after independence. The argument is the situation of Indian economy at that point of time was completely different. And today, the situation in the Indian economy is completely different. What do you mean by this? At that point of a time, we had a huge number of public sector enterprises. The government was very important or was playing a very important role in formulating of policies as well as implementing of these particular policies. If I wanted to put it in a simple term, the government was driving the growth at that point of a time. But today, post 1991, we have implemented the LPG reforms. As a result of this, today the private sector is playing a very, very important role in driving the growth in Indian economy. So the argument is, when the sector composition changes, when how the economy is performing changes, when the role of the private sector is important, you will have to give flexibility to the private sector in case of the labor laws. And it is true that some of these particular labor laws will have to be amended. I'll give a very simple example. The central government in recent times has basically announced that it will be rationalizing the labor laws. That is, basically it has taken around 40 labor laws and has crammed them up into 4 labor codes. And it is going through the democratic process. That is, basically the proposal or the draft was put forward by the government. There was a discussion. Now, various standing committees have looked into it. That is the basic concept of the democratic process. You are listening to all the stakeholders who are involved or who are important in these particular labor law amendments. Now, what has been done by the states? Various states, such as Uttar Pradesh, have relaxed the labor laws for a period of 1,000 days. What is the argument put forward by these particular states? The argument is the economic activity has already slowed down in case of India. After the lockdown is being withdrawn slowly, these particular states want to attract the private sector investment into these particular states. The states are saying that since we have basically stalled or we have relaxed the application of these particular labor laws, these particular companies will be attracted to invest in these particular states, and economic activity is going to revive, production is going to start, employment generation is going to take place, people will start earning the wages, incomes, the supply of goods and services in the market will increase, and concurrently the expendable income of the households will also start increasing, which basically means what? There will be revival of growth. This is the objective with which the states have implemented these particular reforms. Now, the objective is good, but what is the actual implementation? Are there any concerns related to this? These are some of the very important concerns which have been raised by various experts, and I'll be going beyond what has been given in the article. First and foremost, whenever a private sector company wants to invest, they will see whether there is a demand in the market or not. What the government is expecting is the private sector will invest, the salaries will increase or earnings of the households will increase, as a result of which the demand for goods and services will increase. As a result of this, the production again will increase, the earnings of the corporates will also increase. This is not usually the process which is expected by the private sector companies. What private sector says is, if there is a demand in the market, I will naturally produce the goods. So if there is a demand, I will produce. Right now, what is the situation? Demand is very, very less. That is first very important issue. Second, labor law is one very important parameter which is looked into by the private sector before investing. Yes, no doubt related to that. But underline the term, one of the very important reform. What about other reforms? What about the other areas? For example, many times you will come across this argument that Government of India has implemented first generation reforms but has faltered in implementation of a second generation reforms. Now, what is the argument here? In simple terms, first generation reforms refer to the reforms implemented by the government between 1991 to 2000. And the structural, that is other structural reforms such as labor laws, land acquisition, skilling, etc. These particular reforms have been very tardy in terms of implementation in India by the government post 2000. So the argument is, government has implemented first generation reforms but not very well the second generation reforms. Now imagine you are one of the owners of the private sector company. Will you go into a particular state and invest in manufacturing sector when you know that land acquisition is very, very difficult? When you know that availability of skilled labor is very, very poor, and when you know that it is very risky to invest in the market right now, the capital investment or the investment in any of these particular sectors is bound to have certain risk associated with the investment. So that is another argument. Third, the states have moved an ordinance to amend these particular labor laws. Where is the democratic process? Don't you think the states should have basically promoted the involvement of the stakeholders in the system or during the discussion stage? Only after taking into consideration the interest of the stakeholders, the state should have introduced the ordinance. For example, trade unions. When the state increases, let's say the number of hours, although many states announced it, later withdrew it. The states proposed increase in the number of hours from 8 to 12 hours in a shift without increasing the payment or without increasing the overtime. So the argument of the stakeholders such as trade unions here will be, Why are you increasing the number of hours from 8 to 12 hours? Why don't you increase the number of shift rather than increasing the number of hours? On one side, you are increasing the number of hours and you are not giving or increasing the overtime payment also. And you are increasing the number of hours when there is a huge problem with respect to availability of labor. And that too, these particular labor which is working in the factories will have to follow social distancing norms at this point of a time. So when there are so many constraints, why are you introducing these kind of labor reforms without consulting us? Next very important counter argument is this. When you say the term reform, understand this? When you say the term reform, it basically means you are changing the status quo. You are changing the status quo. You are improving the status quo. Means what? Whatever is the present situation, I am moving away from this particular present situation into some better situation. But by changing these particular labor laws or by suspending these particular labor laws, the state governments have not introduced reform. Rather, the argument is they have gone back into the past. They have introduced certain reforms which are counterproductive to the interest of the labor. What was the private sector asking? The private sector asking for certain easier compliance reforms or laws such as easy hiring and firing policy. Right now, the private sector is already firing the employees. At that point of a time, if you reduce the accountability in the private sector, if you are not holding the private sector accountable when the unemployment rate is so high, don't you think private sector will get a free hand to fire more people? Or let me put it in another way. Rather than using the labor, is there no danger that the private sector might abuse these particular labor laws? That is another very important concern. Citing many of these particular concerns, various trade unions have approached ILO, International Labour Organization, and have filed complaint against these particular labor laws. So this is the discussion related to the labor law reform which is there in the current affairs. Now what is the way forward? The article says that ultimately the call has to be taken by the center, and since these are ordinances, center may simply ask the states to withdraw this particular ordinance or reject this particular ordinance, and the states must start over the process by having a democratic process. That is basically the amendment to the labor laws should be conducted in a democratic manner. This is the basic discussion provided in the article. Now based on this, let me solve a question. Consider the following statements. 1. Labor subject falls in the concurrent list. Correct. ILO was established in 1995. Just make certain points related to ILO. ILO, as already mentioned, stands for International Labour Organization. This was established in 1919 as a result of a Paris conference. What is the role of ILO? Basically, it will ensure the economic and social equality of the workers. In what way? In what form? Basically by introducing certain standards with respect to labor utility or utilization of the labor. This particular authority will be performing this particular function. So first statement is correct, second statement is wrong. Right option will be option A, only one is true. I have also given a descriptive question here. There is no denying that India needs a labor reform, but this needs to be done in a proper way. Or you can replace the term proper way with democratic way. This is one descriptive question. You will have to write in 250 words. Next, the concept of a sovereign credit rating. Another very important piece of news in the current affairs. First and foremost, what do you mean by the term credit rating? Let me start from the basics here. What do you mean by a credit rating? Now imagine you go to a bank and you apply for a loan. When you apply for a loan, obviously bank would want to evaluate how credit worthy you are. In simple terms, before bank gives the loan, bank wants to identify or find out whether you can repay the loan or not. One way of identifying this is by the concept of the credit rating itself. That is basically you as a borrower in the market generally will be given certain credit score. And this particular credit score for the borrowers in India will be provided by CIBIL. Credit Information Bureau of India. Now, higher the score provided by the CIBIL means more credit worthy you are as a borrower. Imagine you have borrowed a loan from a particular bank, let's say for a two-wheeler. You have promptly repaid the loan to the bank. You have taken a housing loan from another bank. You have promptly repaid the housing loan. You have taken a credit card from some other bank. You have been promptly repaying the amount to this particular bank. So whenever you are a good borrower in the market, basically you will be accorded with a higher credit rating. And with higher credit rating, it simply means your credit worthiness in the market will increase. People will find it easier to lend to you. So in case of individuals, we use the term credit score. But don't you think in the same way, companies will also borrow from the market? Government will also borrow from the market? So how do we assess the credit worthiness of these kind of borrowers? Government will issue the bonds in the market. Companies will also issue the bonds in the market. So the idea of a credit worthiness in case of the companies as well as a government will be ascertained by the concept of a credit rating. So in simple terms, credit rating stands for representation of a credit worthiness of a borrower. I'll repeat it. Credit rating stands for representation of a credit worthiness of a borrower. The three very important international credit rating agencies are: one, S&P, second, Moody's, and the third one is Fitch. I'll repeat it. The three very important credit rating agencies in the international market are Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. And all the three are there in the newspaper discussion now. Next point. In case of the credit rating, they'll basically divide the credit rating under two heads. First head is called as a investment grade, and the second head is called as a junk grade. Investment grade means higher credit rating. For example, in case of a Moody's, if you have a look at the credit rating, any credit rating above Baa3 will be referred to as or any credit rating of Baa3 plus above this will be referred as investment grade. And investment grade means the risk of investing in these particular securities is comparatively lesser. I'll use the term comparatively lesser because if you invest in the market, there is always a risk. You invest in any security, any instrument in the market, there is always a risk associated with that investment. So I will make a comparison. Compared to what? Compared to any other rating. In case of Moody's itself, any credit rating below Ba3 will be having a junk grade or a speculative grade. That means the risk of investing in these particular securities will increase if they have a credit rating below Baa3. Again, in case of Moody's, it will be Baa3, Baa2, so on and so forth. Whereas in case of the S&P as well as a Fitch, you will see the credit rating in the form of AAA, AA, triple B, single A, so on and so forth. So again, I'll repeat the important points here. In case of the credit rating, it represents the credit worthiness of the borrower in the market, such as the government, such as the private sector. Higher the rating, higher will be the safety associated with the investment. Lower the rating, high risk will be associated with the investment. In case of an economy, whenever the credit rating is associated with it, this credit rating is called as a sovereign credit rating. Now, next point, what is there in the current affairs? Moody's has announced that it is downgrading the credit rating of India from Baa2 to Baa3. What is the meaning of this? There is a downgrade of India's credit rating, and this particular new credit rating is the last standard or last classification in the investment grade. Any further downgrade of India's credit rating, basically India will fall into a junk grade or speculative grade. This is one announcement. And there is another article where S&P has confirmed India's rating as well as outlook. Which means on one side Moody's has downgraded India, and on the other side S&P as well as Fitch have maintained the same kind of a credit rating as well as the outlook for the Indian economy. Now I've introduced another term, outlook. What is the meaning of the term outlook here? Follow this very carefully. outlook basically refers to in the coming days which side the credit rating will be moving. I'll repeat the statement here. Outlook basically means the credit rating agency is telling you in the next couple of months which side will be the credit rating moving. The outlook will be three types. One is positive, second one is stable, and the third one is negative. What is the meaning of each of them? If basically one agency says outlook is stable, means what? In the next couple of months, the credit rating will remain the same. If the agency rather says outlook is positive, it means credit rating is expected to improve. And on the other hand, if the agency says outlook is negative, more probable that one more downgrade will be provided. That is the concept of the outlook. Now, in case of the S&P, they have affirmed the credit rating for India as well as the outlook. Whereas Moody's in last year has changed the outlook for India from stable to negative, and then in this year very recently has downgraded the credit rating for Indian economy. Now, next very important point, what is the impact of this particular downgrade? Will there be any impact or not? First and foremost, any change in the outlook or the credit rating will have certain impact on the market. But if you have seen the news very carefully, the announcement was done by Moody's. Next day, the stock market did not behave or react violently against this particular decision of the Moody's. You did not see a sudden drop in the stock market. Why? For a simple reason. The stock market had already absorbed the news that there are certain troubling issues for the Indian economy. For example, Moody's stated that the reason for the downgrade are: one, for a very high time period now, for last couple of years, there has been a very low sustained growth rate in case of Indian economy. Second, government has implemented the reforms, but these particular reforms are not yielding expected results. Third, very important point, the debt of the government, public debt of the government is actually ballooning. What is this idea of a public debt? It simply means the overall liabilities of the government are increasing. The overall liability, that is including state as well as center, the public debt stood at around 72% of GDP. And as per various surveys, this is expected to balloon to 84% of GDP. And when the debt increases like this, it means the liability or the repayment of the state as well as center is also going to increase. And when the repayment liability increases, the burden or the financial pressure on the state will also increase. And we do not want to increase this particular burden in the present situation for a simple reason. On one side, the expenditure is increasing, and on the other side, the receipts or the incomes of both center as well as state are declining. So when the debt increases, liability increases, but to repay the liability where the resources are available for center and state. That is one more concern. So the market had already absorbed this particular piece of news. As a result of this, if you have seen the news, the market did not react violently to this particular piece of news. Next, there will be a certain impact of this particular piece of news wherein there is a downgrade for the credit rating. Now, what is this particular impact? Certain foreign investors, whenever they are looking to invest in any of the markets, one very important parameter that they will look at is the concept of credit rating itself. And when there's a downgrade of a sovereign credit rating, and that too, that India's economic status stands at the lowest score or lowest level in case of investment grade with a negative outlook, which means there is a high possibility that there could be one more downgrade and Indian economy will fall into the junk status. So it might affect, I'm not saying it will affect, it might affect some of the investments. Next, certain foreign investors such as FIIs, foreign institutional investors, for example, the pension funds, investment funds, usually prefer to invest or are bound to invest in the bonds which will have very high credit rating. And when the credit rating will keep on declining like this, by guidelines they are prohibited to invest in these kind of bonds. Next, with the downgrading of the sovereign credit rating, Indian companies might find it very difficult to borrow in the international market. For a simple reason, the sovereign credit rating basically represents the health of the economy. And when there is a downgrade, it means the risk associated with the economy has increased. So the foreign investor, when he is about to give a loan to Indian company, either he will charge a higher rate of interest, or it might be very difficult for Indian companies to borrow from the international market. So these are some of the repercussions of this particular downgrade of a sovereign credit rating. So this is a basic discussion related to this particular article. Based on this discussion, I have given you a descriptive question. Discuss the sovereign credit rating and the likely impact of a downgrade on the Indian economy. You will have to write this particular answer in 250 words. The next article is related to subsidies and cash transfers. Now, what are the points given in this particular article? First and foremost, the growth in GVA in agriculture sector, GVA stands for gross value addition, in the agriculture sector is around 4% for 2019 and 2020. And during the same tenure, the overall GVA growth rate for Indian economy was 3.9%, which means the GVA contribution or the growth rate of GVA contribution from agriculture sector is higher than the overall economy's GVA growth rate. Second very important point. For this particular current fiscal, the GVA growth rate in the agriculture sector is expected to be around 2.5%. Whereas, as per CRISIL report, the overall Indian economy is expected to contract by around 5%. So you can see that even when the economy is contracting, there is a positive contribution from the agriculture sector to the Indian economy. First, second very important point. The article mentions that around 45%, I'm just rounding it off, around 45% of the labor in case of India is concentrated in the agriculture sector itself. And the agriculture sector is very, very important because of this. And apart from this, a huge number of households are directly dependent on the incomes generated from the agriculture sector as well as allied sectors. Third very important point. The article basically compares what is the performance of agriculture sector in India compared to China. First and foremost, the article says that the average farm size in case of India has declined to 1.08 hectares as per agriculture census of 2015 and 2016. Please update the information. Many of the books would have given 1.16 hectares, that is as per the agriculture census of 2011 and 2012. The latest data is available in the government website itself, and as per the latest census in the agriculture sector, the average size of the land holding in agriculture sector has fallen down to 1.08 hectares. That is much more alarming number. Whereas in case of China, the number is much lesser. As per the data given here, the average size of the land holding in case of China is 0.7 hectares. But if you look at the growth rate of agriculture sector in China for the last 40 years, it has registered an average growth rate of 4.5%. Whereas in case of India, the growth rate of agriculture sector has been very erratic. In certain years, contribution has been more than 4%. In certain years, contribution has declined. Take for example, last couple of years itself. In 2015 and 2016, because of the drought, agriculture sector suffered. Then in 17 and 18, because of a huge amount of rainfall, agriculture sector again suffered. So when you compare against China, India's agriculture sector is not performing very well. With having per average land holding much lesser compared to India, China produces almost 3 times more food crops compared to India's production. This is another very important point mentioned in the article. Next very important point mentioned here is, in case of China, the labor involved in the agriculture sector is high. It is very high even in case of India also. But one very important point of difference between the labor involved in agriculture sector between China and India is that in case of China, the labor is getting skilled and is moving away from agriculture sector. That is basically there is a demand pull factor which is working in case of the labor in China. Whereas in case of India, there is a push factor which is pushing this particular excess labor from the agriculture sector into other sectors. What is the basic difference there? In case of China, the labor is getting skilled. They are moving away from agriculture sector into more productive sectors. Whereas in case of India, agriculture sector is unable to sustain this many population, these many employees in a single sector. these particular people are unable to find work, unable to earn wages being involved in the agriculture sector. Hence, they are moving away from the agriculture sector. This is another very important point of difference you will have to make a note of. Next, this article discusses one of the objectives of Government of India, that is doubling the income of the farmers. The government has the objective of doubling the income of the farmers, but in the last couple of years, if you see the average growth rate in the agriculture sector, that is between financial year 17 to financial year 20, the sector has grown at a pace of 4.8%. And this year it is expected to grow at 2.5% as mentioned earlier. And if the agriculture sector grows by even 4% plus in the next couple of years, that is in the next 2 years, then for 7-year duration between 17 to 23, this is the duration which has been given by the government to double the income of the farmers. The average growth rate in the agriculture sector will be 4.2%. Whereas as per Ashok Dalwai Committee, in order to double the income of the farmers in agriculture sector, the sector has to grow by over 10.4% annually. So the target was 10.4%, and for the same duration, that is 17 to 23, assuming next 2 years the growth rate will be 4%, agriculture sector will be growing by around 4.2%, which means forget about doubling the income of the farmers. The government might find it even difficult to increase the farmers' income by 50% during this particular said time. So these are some of the very important points that discussed in this particular article. The next article is related to forex reserves. For the first time, the forex reserves in India have crossed more than $500 billion. Now, what do you mean by forex reserves? Forex reserves are maintained by RBI. This is a sum total of foreign currency assets, gold reserves held by RBI, SDR, special drawing rights held by government, basically held with RBI, plus reverse tranche position at IMF. So all of these put together will give you the component or the total of a forex reserves. Now, why these are important? Forex reserves are important for multiple reasons. First and foremost, whenever there is a volatility in the market, the market I am referring to is the forex market. For example, there is a sudden outflow of dollars from the Indian market to the external market. You must have read it in the newspaper. A couple of months ago, this actually happened. There was a sudden outflow of foreign institutional investors from Indian market to the external market. That usually happens. Now, when there is a sudden outflow like this, there will be volatility created in the forex market, wherein dollar will start appreciating, rupee will start depreciating. At this point of a time, RBI will conduct a process which the IMF refers to that as a dirty float, wherein basically RBI infuses dollars into the market and purchases the rupees from the market. Now we can understand the process here. What is actually happening in the market? The foreign institutional investors are taking rupees. Now why will they take rupees? Imagine this. There is a foreign institutional investor X who has entered into India. He has converted his dollars, gone to the stock market, purchased shares. Just one hypothetical example. Now when there is a volatility, what he will do? He will be afraid of holding his investment in terms of rupees. He would rather hold his investment in terms of dollars. So what he will do? He will withdraw the investments from the stock market, basically sell the shares, collect rupees, go to the forex market, sell rupees, purchase dollars. So what is happening? The supply of rupees in the market is increasing and demand for dollars in the market is increasing. And the basic concept of economics will tell you that whenever supply of any commodity increases, the prices should start coming down. And when demand for a particular commodity starts increasing like this, the prices should start increasing. That is exactly what happens in the forex market. Rupee value will start sinking or coming down, which we refer to it as a depreciation, whereas a dollar value will start increasing, which we refer to as appreciation. So in this context, what happens? Rupee will start depreciating, dollar will start appreciating. This kind of fluctuations to a very great extent are not good for Indian economy. So RBI will do exactly opposite to what the market is doing. That is, sell dollars, purchase rupees, thereby, please note on the term here, stabilizing the rupee value. whenever you're writing the answer in the mains, please mention the term RBI stabilizes the rupee rate. Do not write the term RBI fixes the rupee rate. RBI is not in the business of fixing the rupee value. It is in the business of stabilizing the value of rupee. Okay, so one very important factor of having huge amount of forex reserves is what? These kind of volatilities can be controlled. Or else you can also write it will provide a cushion to the market. Higher the amount of forex reserves, market participants will know that in case of huge volatility, RBI will intervene and try to stabilize the exchange rate. Second, higher the amount of forex reserves, you will have more cushion to pay for your imports. You can understand this? Higher the amount of forex reserves, you will have more cushion to pay for your imports. And since Indian economy is a net importer, higher the amount of forex reserves, more cushion for ensuring the imports will keep on coming into India. Third, there is also a concept called as a import cover. What do you mean by import cover? Using these particular forex reserves, for how many months of imports you can pay for. I'll repeat the statement here. Using the available forex reserves, how many months of imports can be covered by the economy. And higher the import cover, more will be the cushion to the market. And with the increased forex reserves, the import cover for India has crossed more than 12 months. Now these are some of the advantages of having huge amount of forex reserves. Now why the forex reserves have suddenly spiked up like this? Around 1991, India was on the threshold of the BOP crisis, which basically means we were about to exhaust all our forex reserves. We had somewhere over $5 billion worth of forex reserves. But from there, we have continuously kept on building the forex reserves. As a result of this, today we have more than $500 billion worth of forex reserves. But suddenly in the last couple of months, why there has been a spike in the forex reserves? This has happened because of three very important reasons. One, the crude oil prices have declined. Now what is the connection between crude oil prices and forex reserves? Imagine this. Today, 1 barrel of a crude oil will cost you $50. Means what? To purchase 1 barrel of crude oil, I'll have to pay $50. But tomorrow, this particular same barrel of a crude oil, the cost will fall down to, let's say, $45. So can you see this particular equation here? With this particular decline in the international crude oil prices, the money that will be paid to purchase the crude oil will also come down. So the import bill of the crude oil has actually come down. So when the import bill will come down, the payment will reduce, more forex reserves will be there within Indian economy. First. Second, very recently, a lot of FDI has started flowing into Indian economy. I'll repeat the statement. Very recently, lot of FDI has started flowing into Indian economy, foreign direct investment. For example, Facebook is purchasing 10% ownership in one of the telecom companies in India. In addition to that, FIIs, foreign institutional investments, have started coming back into India. As a result of both of them, is it okay if I say that dollars will start flowing back into India? This is another very important reason why the forex reserves have increased in the recent times. Third very important reason, the imports overall also have declined. Although this is not a very good news considering imports are very important in terms of consumption in the domestic market, overall imports have declined. As a result of this, the dollar outflows have also come down. Adding all of these three factors together, it has led to huge amount of increase in the forex reserves. So these are some of the very important points of discussion related to the article given here. So these are the various articles as well as the questions related to these particular articles for this particular time period. Thank you. Have a good day.